All right, ready to get philosophical.
Always up for a good thought experiment.
Well, you guys sent in some seriously dense stuff this time. Excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, no less.
Ah, yes, the entry on counterfactual theories of causation.
That's the one. So today's deep dive is all about how philosophers use what-if scenarios to, well, to figure out cause and effect.
Exactly. It's about tracing how one specific event leads to another. Singular causation, they call it.
Singular causation. So not just like general trends, but really specific instances.
You got it. Think of it like following the precise path of dominoes falling.
Okay, so not just saying smoking causes cancer, but more like that cigarette on that day led to that tumor. Getting really granular.
Precisely. The basic idea is this. If the cause didn't happen, neither would the effect.
Sounds straightforward enough.
Oh, trust me, it gets complicated. That's where the counterfactuals come in, those hypothetical what-if statements.
Right, because we can't actually rewind reality and see what would happen differently.
Exactly, that's the challenge. And to tackle that, we're starting with David Lewis's 1973 theory.
David Lewis, now he was a pretty big deal in philosophy, right?
Oh, absolutely, a giant in the field. He basically argued that causal dependence hinges on those counterfactuals. To say event C causes event E, you got to be able to say, if C hadn't happened, neither would E.
Right, that makes sense. But how do we actually test those counterfactuals? It's not like we have a time machine.
Well, Lewis had some key ideas about how to make those judgments. For one, the events have to be distinct, you know.
Distinct.
Yeah, like writing the letter L doesn't cause you to write R in Larry. Those are too closely intertwined.
Right, they're practically the same action.
Exactly. There needs to be real separation between cause and effect for the counterfactual to, well, to be meaningful.
So no cheating by picking causes and effects that are basically the same thing. What else did Lewis focus on?
Ah, he emphasized non-backtracking counterfactuals, meaning we only change things at the point of the cause and see how the future unfolds from there.
So no butterfly effect shenanigans.
Exactly. We're playing by stricter rules here.
Okay, makes sense. So this brings us to something that I'll admit I've never really thought about before. Temporal asymmetry.
Yes, the classic question of why causation seems to flow from past to future.
Like, why can't future events cause past ones? I guess it seems so obvious that causes come before effects.
It does seem intuitive, doesn't it? But Lewis argued that this directionality comes from the way events depend on each other.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, effects tend to be determined by their causes, but it's rare for causes to be what we call overdetermined by their effects.
Overdetermined. I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so picture this. Greta cracks an egg at 8:00 a.m., then she fries and eats it. Pretty standard breakfast routine.
Oh, so good.
Now, we'd say the cracking caused the eating because if she hadn't cracked it, she wouldn't have eaten it. Makes sense.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
But what about a world where Greta didn't crack the egg, yet somehow a fried egg magically appears on her plate?
Now, that's a convenient universe.
Hmm.
But I see what you're getting at. Why is changing the past, not the future, considered more plausible?
Because to make the future match up with a changed past, you'd need a whole series of unlikely events. The eggshell magically vanishing, Greta having a false memory of cracking the egg, and so on.
It would take a bunch of mini miracles.
Exactly.
Whereas if we change the past, the future just unfolds naturally without needing those contrivances. So it's not that backward causation is impossible, just highly, highly improbable.
You've got it.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how these counterfactuals can get pretty tricky.
They do. And this leads us to another key concept, the transitivity of causation.
Transitivity.
Basically, the idea that if event C causes D and D causes E, then C also causes E.
Like a chain reaction.
Right. Think of those dominoes. If one knocks over another, which then knocks over a third, that first domino indirectly caused the third one to fall.
Okay, yeah, that seems intuitive.
But even this seemingly simple idea has faced challenges. Yeah, another philosopher, Ned Hall, came up with a thought experiment involving a hiker.
Okay, I love a good thought experiment. What's the scenario?
So this hiker sees a boulder rolling down a hill and, naturally, ducks to avoid it.
Makes sense.
This ducking then allows him to continue walking along the path.
So the boulder caused the ducking, and the ducking caused the continued walking. But did the boulder really cause the hiker to keep walking? It almost seems like the opposite.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive. And this example, along with others like Douglas Ehring's potassium salt scenario, highlighted the potential problems with assuming causation is always transitive.
So how do defenders of transitivity respond to these counterarguments? They don't just ignore them, right?
Of course not. Lewis argued that we often confuse what generally happens with what happened in the specific instance. Yes, boulders usually stop hikers.
But in this case, the unique chain of events let the hiker continue. So the focus should be on the specifics, not our general expectations.
Exactly. Another defense comes from the contrastivist account of causation, which emphasizes the context of the causal claim.
Meaning?
Well, the contrast we're making in the first part of the chain might be different from the contrast in the second part, so transitivity doesn't neatly apply.
So instead of just saying the boulder caused the walking, we need to be more specific, like the boulder caused the walking rather than stopping the hiker.
You got it. The contrast we choose shapes our understanding of the causal relationship.
Wow, okay, this is getting nuanced. I'm thinking about those classic examples like Billy and Susie throwing rocks at a bottle. How does Lewis's theory handle those preemption cases?
Ah, yes. Preemption. That's
Yeah.
where things get even more interesting. And Lewis actually distinguished between early and late preemption.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the difference?
Well, in early preemption, the backup cause is stopped before it can have its effects. Think of two assassins trying to shoot someone. Whoever gets the shot off first preempts the other.
Okay, but with Billy and Susie, it's different, right? Susie's throw shatters the bottle before Billy's rock even gets there.
Exactly. That's late preemption. And this posed a bit of a challenge for Lewis's initial theory,
How so?
because even if Susie hadn't thrown, the bottle would still have shattered thanks to Billy. So how can we say Susie's throw caused the shattering?
It's like acknowledging that Billy was about to step in and get the job done, but Susie stole his causal thunder.
That's a great way to put it. So the question becomes, how do we account for that within the counterfactual framework?
Yeah, how do we?
Well, Lewis tried to address late preemption using the concept of quasi-dependence. He argued that the bottle-shattering quasi-depends on Susie's throw, because if we imagine a scenario where only Susie throws, the shattering happens in the exact same way.
So it's like acknowledging that Susie's throw set the whole chain of events in motion, regardless of whether Billy was there or not.
Precisely. However, even Lewis himself wasn't entirely satisfied with this solution.
He wasn't.
Nope. He felt it didn't quite capture the nuance of more complex preemption cases, especially those involving something called trumping.
Trumping. Okay, now I'm really curious.
To understand those, we'll have to move on to his revised theory, the 2000 version.
A sequel. Well, I'm definitely ready to hear how he tackled those trickier cases.
All right, so David Lewis, back at it again with his updated theory in 2000.
A refined take on causation, huh? So what did he change? Ditch the counterfactuals entirely.
Not quite. He still used them, but shifted the focus a bit. Instead of just asking whether an event would happen in a different scenario, he started looking at how it would happen.
How it would happen.
Yeah, the timing, the manner, all those little details.
Okay, so instead of saying if Susie hadn't thrown, the bottle wouldn't have shattered, we're getting more specific, like if Susie had thrown a split second later, would the bottle have broken differently?
You got it. He introduced this idea of an alteration of an event, a slight change in timing or manner, and then we see how those ripple through the causal chain.
So like running a bunch of tiny experiments in our minds, tweaking the cause and seeing what happens to the effect.
Exactly. And he called this new approach influence.
Influence, huh? Catchy.
One event influences another if there's a pattern of counterfactual dependence between the ways they occur.
So if a small change in Susie's throw consistently leads to a corresponding change in how the bottle breaks, then her throw has influence. But if Billy could change his throw a lot and it doesn't affect the outcome, then his throw doesn't have that same influence.
Precisely. And in this revised theory, causation is just a chain of these influences.
Okay, so this might help with those tricky late preemption cases. But walk me through it. How does this apply to Billy and Susie?
Well, now we can say Susie's throw has this unique influence on the shattering that Billy's doesn't have. Even if Billy slightly changes his throw, throws a bit harder or aims differently, it doesn't change what happens. Susie's rock still gets there first.
But if we tweak Susie's throw even a tiny bit, it changes the shattering. So her throw has this special influence that Billy just doesn't, even though Billy's throw could have done the job if Susie hadn't been there.
Exactly. This also helps with those trumping cases. Remember the example of the major and the sergeant?
Oh, right. The one where they both yell, advance.
Yep. The soldiers obey the major because, well, he outranks the sergeant.
Even though they technically heard both orders.
Right. So in this 2000 theory, we'd say that Changes to the major's order do change whether the troops advance and how they do it, but messing with the sergeant's order doesn't really do anything. The major's authority trumps the sergeant's, and that's reflected in those counterfactual influences.
Okay, I see how this refined theory can handle more complex situations. But I bet some philosophers still weren't convinced. Any pushback against Lewis's 2000 theory?
Of course. There are always different viewpoints. Some folks argue that even in the late preemption case, Billy's throw does have some influence on the outcome. They said that if Billy had thrown earlier or harder or with a different spin, the shattering could have been different.
But wouldn't that make things incredibly messy? If you start considering every tiny alteration, then almost anything could be a cause.
That's the worry. Lewis's response was to argue that those alterations are too distant or irrelevant to be considered genuine influences. He essentially drew a line in the sand.
A line between the significant and the insignificant. But who gets to decide where that line is? Seems like we're just adding more complexity.
And that's where things get even more debatable. Lewis's criteria for determining relevant influences were, well, open to interpretation. And some philosophers felt that this whole reliance on counterfactuals, even with the updates, just had some inherent limitations.
So what other options were there? Any totally different ways of thinking about singular causation?
Actually, yeah, one that's gained a lot of traction is the structural equations framework, or SEF for short.
Ceph. Sounds like a departure from Lewis's world of counterfactuals.
It is. SEF provides a more formal, systematic way to represent those causal relationships.
Formal and systematic, like equations and stuff.
You got it. Think of it as building a model of the causal system using variables and equations.
Variables and equations. Now we're talking physics.
There's definitely a more mathematical flavor to it, but the core philosophical concepts are still there. It's just a different way of representing them, you know?
All right, I'm intrigued. How does this Ceph thing actually work? Can we stick with Billy and Susie to see it in action?
Absolutely. So imagine we're building a model of that whole rock throwing scenario. We assign a variable to each event. BT for Billy throws, ST for Susie throws, BH for Billy hits the bottle, SH for Susie hits, and BS for the bottle shattering.
So translating those events into a code.
Exactly. Then we use equations to capture the causal connections between these variables. For example, we might have the equation SHST, meaning if Susie throws, Susie's rock hits the bottle.
Nice and straightforward. These equations are like the rules of the game.
Precisely. And here's where the counterfactuals come back in. Those equations actually express counterfactual dependencies. Like the equation BH, BT, and SH means that Billy's rock hits if he throws and Susie's rock doesn't.
Right, so we're still dealing with what-if scenarios, but now they're built into these equations.
Exactly. And just like with Lewis's theories, there are rules for evaluating those counterfactuals within Ceph. One key technique is called surgical intervention.
Surgical intervention.
We basically change the value of one variable in the model and see what happens to the others. Like what happens if we prevent Susie from throwing?
It's like running simulations in our model.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really crucial concept in Ceph, the active causal route.
Okay, I'm ready. What's an active causal route?
Think of it as a chain of variables where a change in one leads to a change in the final outcome, even if we keep other variables constant, kind of like those non-backtracking counterfactuals Lewis talked about.
So, in the Billy and Susie case, there's an active route from Susie throwing to the bottle shattering,
Yeah,
but not from Billy throwing to the bottle shattering.
right. We can mess with Billy's side of the model all we want, but Susie's action is the real driver here.
This is how Ceph handles those late preemption cases.
Yep. Elegant, isn't it?
Definitely seems more precise, maybe even more powerful than just thinking about counterfactuals in a loosey-goosey way, but I'm sensing there might be some downsides to all this formality.
You're on the right track. There are always trade-offs. Not everyone's convinced that Ceph is the ultimate solution to the causation puzzle. And we'll get into some of those debates in the next segment.
All right, so we've gone through David Lewis's counterfactual theories, and now we've got this CES, the structural equations framework. It seems pretty neat and tidy, but you mentioned there are some issues with it. Not everyone's on board.
Right. I mean, for one thing, there's no single correct Ceph model, you know? Building a model always involves choices, like which variables to include, how to define them, how to connect them.
So it's not like a magic formula. You don't just plug in the events, and boom, out comes the causal structure.
No, there's still room for interpretation, even with all the equations. And this has led to a lot of back and forth about what makes a model apt, like what makes it a good fit for the situation.
Apt. Okay. So some people say the model needs to reflect the actual mechanics of the system. Others focus on stability, meaning the model's conclusions shouldn't change too much if you tweak things a bit.
Exactly. Choosing the right model is almost an art in itself.
But then how do we avoid ending up with different Ceph models that give us totally different answers about the same situation?
That's a big one. And it ties into a bigger debate about the nature of causation itself, contextualism versus invariantism. Remember that.
Well, yeah, we touched on that with Lewis. It's about whether causation is an objective thing or if it depends on how we're looking at it.
Exactly. Lewis was all about invariantism. Causation is causation, regardless of our perspective.
He had that analogy about saying it's cold in here, even if the room temperature is technically the same everywhere.
Right. We focus on what's relevant to us. But even Lewis admitted some cases are harder to explain that way, like that example with Susie and the coconut cake.
Yeah, in some contexts, her stealing the cake caused her to get sick, but in others, it didn't, even though she did the same thing.
It all depends on what we're contrasting it with. If we're comparing stealing to buying the cake, then her action didn't cause the illness. But if it's stealing versus leaving empty-handed, then it did.
So the causal judgment changes based on the contrast.
Precisely. And examples like that have led some philosophers to embrace contextualism, the idea that causation itself is context-dependent. It's not just about the events, but also about how we frame the question.
So where does Ceph land in this debate?
It's a bit of both, actually. A lot of the discussion within Ceph has been about those cases where you have two situations with identical models but different judgments about what caused what.
Identical models, different judgments, how does that even happen?
Well, think about this bogus prevention case. A bodyguard thinking someone poisoned their client's coffee adds an antidote. But it turns out the coffee was never poisoned.
Oh, okay. So did the bodyguard's action cause the client to survive?
Our gut says no, right? There was no real threat, so the bodyguard didn't actually do anything.
Right.
But you can build a Ceph model of this that looks just like the one where Billy and Susie both hit the bottle at the same time. In that case, we say both throws caused the shattering, but with the bodyguard, we wouldn't say their action caused survival.
So same structure, different conclusions. That's weird.
It is. And one way Ceph tries to deal with this is by bringing in these ideas of defaults and deviants.
Defaults and deviants. Okay, what are those?
The idea is we focus on events that go against our expectations,
Like Billy and Susie both throwing rocks is unexpected, deviant. But a bodyguard protecting their client, that's normal.
Exactly. And that difference in normality, some argue, influences how we think about the cause, even if the model itself is the same.
But who decides what's normal? That seems pretty subjective.
And that's a major criticism of this approach. Critics say there's no objective way to set those defaults, so it undermines the idea of causation as something independent of our views.
So we're back to that fundamental question. Is causation something real out there in the world, or is it something we kind of impose on events?
That's the heart of it, and honestly, there's no easy answer. The contextualism and variantism debate just keeps going, even within Ceph.
Wow, we really went down the rabbit hole with this one. It's amazing how these seemingly simple ideas about cause and effect can get so complicated.
That's philosophy for you, always challenging our assumptions, even about the stuff that seems obvious.
And it's wild how thinking about these what-ifs, these counterfactuals, can reveal so much about how we understand the world.
It's like this mental tool we have, imagining alternatives. What if things had gone differently?
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive into counterfactual theories of causation, the Ceph, and all these mind-bending ideas, I want to encourage you all to keep playing those what-if games. Look around, notice what's happening, and ask yourself, what if something had been just a little bit different? You might be surprised at what you discover. And until next time, keep on exploring.